So I'm so excited to get to our program today. Rotary member Stu Levitan is our speaker. Stu has been a mainstay of Madison media and politics since 1975 and an award-winning print and broadcast journalist. He currently hosts Books and Beats on 92.1 FM, the Mike and Access, City Hall on Madison City Channel. Stu will provide us an illustrated talk on the events and individuals highlighting a turbulent time on a changing campus, the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1960. We look forward to your presentation, Stu, and made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way of saying thanks for speaking us today. As we welcome him to the podium, I want to remind you that if time permits, and hopefully it will, that we will have microphones moving about the audience for questions. So please give a warm welcome to Stu Levitan.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for that song selection. It is both relevant and much appreciated. And make sure that I have, is this, okay. How many of you went to school or worked at the University of Wisconsin during the 1960s? Okay, so I'm on my best behavior now. Some of your classmates or people you may have taught included Dick Cheney, Tommy Thompson, Jim Doyle, Chuck Robb, Shirley Abrahamson, Bill Bablich, David Prosser, Barbara Crabb, Sue Bauman, and Paul Soglin. Among the celebrated journalists and writers, Pulitzer Prize winner David Marinis, historian Stephen Ambrose, 60 Minutes producer and Pulitzer Prize winning reporter Lowell Bergman, who back then was more of a radical activist than a journalist. That may come as a surprise. Health columnist Jane Brody, speechwriter, author, and the only person to be a two-time editor of the Daily Cardinal, Jeff Greenfield, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Robert McFadden, sports columnist Leonard Shapiro, reporter Jim Rowan, Whitney Gould, Dave Zwiefel, Lester Pines, and Roberta Gassman. Among those who would become prominent in arts and entertainment, our friend musician Ben Sidran, also an author and broadcast personality, Tracy Nelson, Boz Skaggs, Steve Miller, the filmmakers Michael Mann, Errol Morris, the glass artist Dale Chihuly, who was actually a TA while he was here, Daniel J. Travanti, Dr. Zorba Pastor, Mike Wilmington, Joyce Carol Oates, and the airplane gang of Abrahams, Zucker, and Zucker. The era's athletic core included future Green Bay Packers Super Bowl champion center Ken Bowman, Pro Bowl kicker Jim Bakken, College Hall of Famer, Washington football player, and UW athletic director Pat Richter, and some others we will get to in just a moment. Lower Campus, 1962. What's important about this picture is what's not in the picture. There's no Mossy Humanities Building, no Elvium Arts Center, no Vilas Communication Building, no Granger Hall, no Helen C. White Library. You can see the south side of University Avenue looks much as it had for decades before, small shops and restaurants. It would take years for the university and the city to agree on an urban renewal redevelopment plan for those blocks and decades to implement it. Now, I have to admit that when I was in college, I was somewhat of a Hegelian. I actually believed that history was the idea moving through time. Well, I now understand that it's individuals who make history, individuals in life and in death. Last week, the anniversary of a seminal event in the history of the university, the sudden death at age 61, which is seeming younger and younger to me all the time, of its president, Conrad Elvium. He was a first-generation Norwegian American, graduate of Stoughton High School. Elvium took his degrees here and became a distinguished member of the biochemistry faculty. He attained international renown in 1937 by isolating nicotinic acid, we now call it the vitamin niacin, and discovering it could be used to cure the debilitating dietary disease pellagra, which was very prevalent among the poor. He was chair of the biochemistry department at 43, dean of the graduate school 2 years later, published close to 800 scientific papers on biochemistry and nutrition before he was named president after a lengthy national search in 1958. He was modest and unassuming, even somewhat shy, maybe a bit aloof, but his administration was efficient and frugal. But he was not especially interested in undergraduate education or undergraduate life. He saw the university primarily as a great research institute and was far more interested in graduate education and research than in undergraduate life and activities. He would not have enjoyed and probably would not have understood the late 1960s at all. He was prone to high blood pressure and had been dealing for over a year with an intractable personnel issue affecting the School of Medicine and its Department of Surgery. A little after 8 in the morning on Friday, July 27, 1962, it proved too much. He collapsed at his desk in Bascom Hall, was rushed to Madison General Hospital. As he lay dying, his right-hand man was half a world away, teaching an American Studies seminar in Kyoto, Japan. Fred Harvey Harrington was a distinguished historian specializing in American diplomacy, former chair of the history department, and he had been one of Elvium's rivals in 1958, but Elvium brought him into his administration, ultimately making him university vice president. He would be the obvious choice to take over in such a dire situation, but he wasn't really available. Just 2 months prior, he had agreed to become the new president of the University of Hawaii to start on September 15th, less than 7 weeks away. But when Harrington returned to Madison on July 29th, the regents made him acting president. 2 days later, they decided there was no need for a national search if only the Hawaii Board of Regents would release him from his contract. And they did. So it would be Harrington who would preside over the supersizing of the university, largely fueled by federal and foundation funds that he was so aggressive and successful in obtaining. Harrington, an imposing, even somewhat imperious figure at 6'4", as forceful as Elvium was restrained, who would dominate the regents and the legislature until they turned on him. Harrington, who would appoint the 3 Madison chancellors who so defined the campus and beyond: the successful Robin Fleming, the tragic William Sewell, and the enduring Edwin Young. Now, Young was an obvious candidate, maybe Fleming too, but I guarantee you, Conrad Elvium would not have appointed the sociologist William Sewell to serve as chancellor. And based on contemporaneous press accounts, which didn't even include Sewell in the running, no president other than Fred Harvey Harrington would have appointed William Sewell either. And no other president would have suffered the particularly ironic indignity that Harrington did when his administration was finally brought down in the spring of 1970 after years of demonstrations stoked by students who had been inspired by the radical history professors William Appleman Williams and Harvey Goldberg, whom Harrington himself had recruited to the faculty when he was chair of the history department. It is a saga that is almost Shakespearean. And here we get to the happenstance of history. If Elvium had died just a few weeks later, it is very unlikely that Hawaii would have let Harrington out of his contract. A few months later, there's no way they let him out. If Elvium had died in September after school had started, Fred Harvey Harrington would never have become the president of the University of Wisconsin. And the history of the Madison campus, and therefore of Madison, and by extension the state, would have been completely different. You can see from the paper, this is an actual extra edition that Jeff Greenfield put out. Elvium died the morning of Summer Prom, which also featured a jazz concert by Cannonball and Nat Adderley. All events were canceled at the request of the students as a sign of respect for their fallen president, whose memory is for a blessing. Here is the campus near the end of Harrington's 8-year administration. The southeast dorms, that's Celery, Ogg, and Whitty from left to right, are all up. Most of the 800 block is down. That's the Elvium Art Center, so named simply because fundraising was underway when Elvium died. The $9.8 million South Lower Campus building for history, music, art, and art education. We know it as the George L. Massey Humanities Building, which was as architecturally popular back then as it is today. It looks like something out of Mesopotamia, Regent Charles Gillette groused. Looks like a factory, Board President Arthur de Bartleben chimed in. And if you go straight from the space between the two towers of Og up to the lake, you'll see the old red gym, which Harrington and the Regents were absolutely, positively committed to tearing down and replacing with a faculty lounge. And they would have done so. It was in the adopted land use plan, except the students said, wait a minute, that's our gym. You can't tear our gym down. By the time the SURF was built, the ethic of historic preservation was thankfully strong enough that a building that is now on the National Register of Historic Places and is an official city landmark was saved, no thanks to Fred Harvey Harrington and the Regents. That is just one of the very strange land use concepts that Harrington advanced during the decade, including facilities for 15,000 undergraduates at the base of Picnic Point and a full 4-year campus on the Charmony Reeder Farm just 5 miles out Mineral Point Road. An entire second campus in the city of Madison. We will certainly have some sort of campus use here one day, Harrington declared. Very handsome and quite high. I can't resist. Everyone in Bascom and Van Nuys must have been quite high when it came to transportation planning. Oh, come on, you could see that coming, couldn't you? They proposed at various times to ban cars and bicycles from the campus, to build a monorail up the hill, to dig a tunnel underneath University Heights, to raise an elevated highway over Camp Randall. Thankfully, none of these things got off the drawing board, but they were serious proposals. Now, as to the Regents, we had Democratic governors Gaylord Nelson and John Reynolds from 1965 to 69, Republican governor Warren Knowles from 65 to 71, 59 to 65 for the Democrats, 66 to 71 for the Republican. That caused the Board of Regents to undergo a significant ideological change that materially affected the daily lives of students on campus and the university's external relations. Very simply, for most of the decade, the Regents supported, even defended, students, faculty, and administration. But by 68 and 69, the Regents themselves took the lead in attacking all 3 members of that campus community. I'll give you 2 examples, both involving the Daily Cardinal, to prove this point. In 1965, when State Senator Jerris Leonard, who would become a Nixon administration official, attacked the Daily Cardinal because its managing editor, John Gruber, lived in a house with the son of a former chairman of the Wisconsin Communist Party, the Regents were absolutely solid in supporting the Cardinal and telling Leonard to just back off and go away. But in 1968, after the Cardinal printed a college news service item about an SDS meeting that included some words I can't say on the radio and you probably shouldn't put in a newspaper, the Regents themselves attacked the Cardinal and the journalism faculty, ultimately ending a long-standing subsidy, starting to charge rent, even threatening eviction if they did it again. It got so bad and so obvious that a Democratic holdover, former board president de Bartleben, complained in a public meeting about the partisan takeover of the Board of Regents. Speaking of presidents, I'm going backwards, sorry. Speaking of presidents, 1960 saw the start of the public career of Ed Garvey, the new president of the Wisconsin Student Association, who would go on to become president of the National Student Association, head of the NFL Players Association, deputy attorney general, candidate for governor and senator, and just a heck of a guy. Among the losers at this same election, future U.S. Senator and presidential son-in-law Chuck Robb, who was unexpectedly defeated for re-election to the WSA Senate. And a president-to-be, John Kennedy at the Fieldhouse 2 weeks before Election Day. Kennedy's election would have a profound and permanent impact on the city of Madison, as our liberal mayor, Ivan Nestigan, would give up an unopposed election to a 4th term to become JFK's Undersecretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, to be replaced by the conservative Republican Henry Reynolds. thus completely changing the course of Madison history on an even more fundamental level than Elvium's death had changed the university. 37 months later, the state of Wisconsin's official memorial service for President Kennedy, this would not be the last time that the Hill would be used for such a somber and sad occasion. Some people may have expected that a talk on the 60s would be all about sex, drugs, rock and roll. According to my research, there was some of that at the time. That is not what this talk is about. This talk is going to be about some political matters. But just to give you a taste of how hip the campus could be in the 1960s, here are some of the entertainers who played homecoming during the decade. We start with the Count in 1960. Dick Gregory, Maynard Ferguson, Bob Hope, Woody Herman and Tony Bennett, a relative youngster at the time, Nancy Wilson and Harper's Bazaar, Richard Pryor and the Fifth Dimension, and Ramsey Lewis Trio and some other guy. When most people think about political activism on the UW campus in the 1960s, they most likely think about anti-war activities from the mid-60s on. But anti-war activism did not happen in a vacuum, but was preceded and to a considerable extent shaped by the civil rights movement, and not just by adapting tactics like sit-ins and marches and pickets, but on a deeper level of commitment and fearlessness. Students who went south for Freedom Summer or to be a Freedom Rider and face down the Klan in Mississippi absolutely believed that you don't follow wrongful rules and regulations, and they were absolutely not scared by university bureaucrats. If you've gone through the South in the 60s, a dean of students does not concern you. February 1, 1964, what happened? February 1, 1960, 4 black students from North Carolina A&T start their sit-in at the Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina. Before the month was out, students here were setting up their own wildcat pickets at the Woolworths, and in a real precursor of the coming generational split over tactics and strategy, the professionals, the adults, expressly disavowed the action. You can see the top line, local NAACP criticizes action. This would not be the first time that students and an earlier generation would disagree about tactics and strategy. A week later, activists wanted to march to the Capitol, but due to that widespread public criticism of the wildcat picketing, the WSA Student Senate, at the request of WSA President Ed Garvey, declined to endorse the march. So the students, rather than march without an endorsement, held a nice, orderly rally instead, and booed a statement from President Elvium in which he said, quote, "There is some inconsistency in a stand which favors taking organized marching out of ROTC and proposing a disorganized march through the city." You can see why I think he would have had real trouble as the 60s wore on. 10 weeks later, they finally held their march to commemorate the 6th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education and to complain about the slow pace of integration in the South. This march was so sanctioned, it had welcoming comments from Governor Nelson and Conrad Elvium, and it was historic. This was the first university student march to the Capitol since 1954. The issue back then, raising faculty pay, which the students supported. Civil rights also had a very direct impact on a very important, very well-defined subgroup, the young men and women in fraternities and sororities, required to certify that their national charters did not contain invidious discrimination. They agreed to that, but some Greeks balked at the added ban on alumni involvement in pledge selection. So, like everyone else, they marched. October 1962, out of a total Greek universe of only a few thousand people, 1,200 marched up and around Bascom Hill. They marched silently, in the rain, the men in coats and ties, the women in heels. No other demonstration that decade, either civil rights or anti-war would boast such a high percentage of participants or show such discipline. I don't know how many African American students wanted to live in a Greek house, but it couldn't have been many. In 1964, a literal head count established there were fewer than 100 blacks on campus, more of them from Nigeria, 22, than Wisconsin. These statistics surprised university officials who thought there had been some more. While the overwhelmingly white student body engaged in mass actions like Freedom Fast, with a third of the body donating the money they would have spent on dinner the Thursday before Thanksgiving to buy food for the indigent in Mississippi. Some gave more than just money. He wasn't a Badger for long, just a semester in 1961, but Andrew Goodman, murdered by Klansmen in Mississippi along with James Chaney and Mickey Schwerner in that Freedom Summer of 1964, was a Badger. April 5th, 1968. Again, Bascom Hill is a place of communal mourning, this time for Dr. King. And then a march up State Street, the likes of which Madison had never seen before. 3 weeks later, a fiery and very famous black Muslim rejects Dr. King's message, denounces integration and interracial marriages, calls for reparation and separation. An undercover cop in attendance was not impressed by Muhammad Ali. In a report filled with misspellings, he called the champ's comments infantile. That same week, big news from the field house. The UW names Bobby Knight to succeed basketball coach John Erickson, just named general manager of the new Milwaukee Bucks. But the story broke before the mild-mannered 27-year-old was ready to announce it, and he got so upset he withdrew his application. The post would go to John Powless instead. April 9th, 1960. Madison is once again the center of the college boxing world, with a crowd of 10,000 at the field house for the NCAA team and individual championships. The national powerhouse Badgers are led by the stylish southpaw Charlie Moore, the defending champ at 165 pounds, about the nicest boxer you'd ever meet, maybe even too sensitive for the sweet science. A devout Catholic from the South Shore of Long Island, winner of the NCAA Award for Sportsmanship and Conduct, Charlie Moore probably had more real friends than anyone on campus. The national championship all came down to the bout between Moore and a friend of his, Stu Bartell of the San Jose State Spartans, not our Bartells, going for their third straight title. Moore won the first 2-minute round. Then, about halfway through the second round, Bartell lands a terrific right cross, flush on Moore's left forehead. Moore gets up at the count of 2, takes the mandatory standing 9 count, is cleared to continue. The boxers go into a semi-clinch when suddenly Moore's legs begin to buckle, his hands hanging limp. The ref stops the fight at 1:49 of the second round. He made it back to the dressing room unaided, told his coach he was sorry he let the team down. He said he had a little headache and lay down. Then the convulsions started. He was already in a coma with a tear in a major vein and a blood clot in his brain when our own Dr. Mitch Javid operated at University Hospital. The operation stopped the bleeding and drained the clot, but Dr. Javid knew there was little hope. Now, Badger boxing boosters would quickly claim the sport wasn't to claim because Moore had a pre-existing condition, an aneurysm, that could have burst at any time and just happened to go during the bout. Whether or not they believed that, it was not true. But with boxing already under attack here and around the country, they had to say it. Charlie Moore was in a coma for 8 days. He died on Easter morning, April 17th. His memory is for a blessing. 2 days later, Elliot Marinus broke the story in the Capital Times that Moore suffered from depression, was questioning his life as a boxer, saw a psychiatrist a few times, even had electroshock treatment. People wondered whether that affected him the night of the fight. 3 weeks later, on May 9th, the UW faculty declared that boxing, quote, was not an appropriate intercollegiate sport and discontinued it. Other schools soon followed suit, and then the NCAA itself. there would never be another NCAA boxing tournament after the night that Charlie Moore fell at the UW Fieldhouse. Another fine young Wisconsin athlete also caused a complete change in his sport in a much happier manner. Rick Reichert was a football star from Stevens Point, starting fullback on the legendary Rose Bowl team of '63, who went out for baseball one year just to avoid spring drills. Turns out he was even better at that, twice leading the Big Ten in batting, later enshrined in the College Baseball Hall of Fame. After his junior season, a bidding war broke out, which the Los Angeles Angels won for about $200,000. The absurdity of paying a college kid twice what Willie Mays made quickly convinced Major League Baseball to end individual signings and go to an amateur draft, making a Badger baseball's last bonus baby. Ron Vanderkellen sets 3 Rose Bowl records. Pat Richter has 11 receptions, but there are some bad breaks and some even worse calls. Talk about a quick whistle. And a furious fourth quarter finish falls just short as the Badgers finish the 62-63 season number 2 in the AP ratings, but first in the heart of sports fans everywhere. Milt Brune took the Badgers to 2 Rose Bowls in 5 years. Then the team fell to 5th, then 7th. Then the athletic board voted to fire him. The Regents gave him a reprieve, but another 7th place finish was all she wrote. He said he quit. Some say he was fired. Things did not improve under Coach John Cota. The team went winless the next 2 years, which did not help the job security of athletic director Ivy Williamson at all. There was only one man Badger fans wanted to replace him, old Crazy Legs himself, and after much deliberation, he said yes. Another picture of the Hill, the Memorial Cemetery of 1968. 20 years later, we'd see pink flamingos there. Now, this action did not get a lot of pushback, but overall, the anti-war movement did provoke a reaction that did considerable damage to the university by way of lost public, political, and financial support. Given those documented downsides, without any obvious corresponding benefits, after all, the war went on until 1975, I asked a somewhat older activist, was it worth it? That's the wrong question, he said. It's not were the demonstrations worth it, it's were the demonstrations necessary. I think both questions are valid, and I hope to have some answers by the time my manuscript is due next summer. As 1960 saw the start of Ed Garvey's career, 1965 brought the beginning of Paul Sogelin's. Here is his campaign statement running for the WSA Student Senate, in which he promises, quote, a radical approach to student government which challenges the decadent order. He won and won re-election, and then gave it up, quit halfway through his second term to write an occasional column for the Daily Cardinal, one of which was so significant that David Marinus quoted it in his epic account of the Dow demonstration. They marched into sunlight. It is a remarkable column. He is publicly declaring that there will be an obstructive sit-in to block job interviews of the Dow Chemical Company, directly defying the faculty and administration. It did not go well. They even arrested Miss Sifting and Winnowing. In real life, Vicki Gabriner, who, yes, had done extensive civil rights work in Tennessee and helped create the extraordinary collection of civil rights source material, now part of the Civil Rights History Project, where else but the Wisconsin Historical Society archives. Suddenly, people who had nothing to do with the demonstration were getting tear gassed. People got hurt, they got arrested, they got radicalized, which is one of the reasons why Dow 2 was the single most important political event of the decade on campus. It marked the end of the summer of love and the beginning of the days of rage. And there's another reason why it's so important. It is what made Paul Soglin a star. In an oral history decades later, Chancellor Sewell called Soglin a second or third-rate figure at the time, more of a talker than a doer. And here he is in his trademark sheepskin coat, that's him at the ledge, talking to a crowd on Library Mall. But more importantly, here he is off campus, representing students on a panel with future mayoral foe Bill Dyke and the police department's #2 man, head-cracking Herman Thomas, which was a nice validation for someone in the midst of an aldermanic campaign. And in case you can't see the captions, Paul is the one on the left. A few months later, it's Alderman Soglin. The goatee is gone. The mustache would last only until deputies unceremoniously shaved him after he was arrested at the Mifflin Block Party riot in 1969. And then, less than a year later, not even 15 months since that student rights panel with Bill Dyke and Herman Thomas, a 5-page feature in Look magazine. And the rest, as they say, is history. Thank you. I think we got a minute or two. I think I went through that fast enough that we got a minute or two for some questions, if anybody has any. In case you're asking, this is adapted from the forthcoming Madison in the 60s to be published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press in the fall of 2018. I hope to come back then and sell some books. Are there any questions? Nobody's got any questions. I could have talked. Oh, yeah, there we go.
You made an allusion, a connection between the civil rights movement in the early 1960s and the anti-war movement of the late 1960s. Now, I think the general common complaint about the anti-war movement was that it was very selfish. It was students who were dedicated to avoiding the draft and who opposed the war for that reason. But you seem to be implying that there was a long-standing tradition of protest on this campus beginning in the 1960s that was based on principle.
To be fair to those who've gone before me, it didn't start in the 60s. I mean, the 60s, there were anti-ROTC, anti-nuclear weapons demonstrations in the 40s and the 50s. So we didn't invent it in the 60s. But as to the point about selflessness or selfishness, the thing about the draft is very interesting. In 1966, we were drafting 30,000 men a month. 30,000 men a month. And we went to what had been the Korean War manner in which class ranking and academic good status became relevant. Previously, if you were a student, you got the deferment. Then in '66, they tightened the restrictions. You had to either be doing well in school or score well on the test. This is when the anti-draft movement started to get the university to not comply with the selective service system, to not give class rankings, to not provide a place for the test, because they felt that by making university status your way out of the draft, they were consigning black and brown and poor students to the war and protecting the upper middle class white students. And for a white upper middle class college student in the 1960s to say, do away with the class rankings standard, do away with tests, that was subjecting himself to the draft. Now, it was also subjecting all his classmates who might not have wanted to be subjected to the draft. But the anti-draft movement was on one level, was very selfless. It was democratizing the risk of going to war and reminding the power elite, hey, if your children are going to war, maybe you'll be a little less eager to prolong this activity. Certainly there were some people who just wanted to get out of the draft, but I think that the larger message of the anti-draft movement, Rich, was it is an unfair advantage which we want to give up and subject ourselves to what the black and the brown and the poor students are also going through. This woman had it. Anybody else? Oh, boy, that was good. Counselor.
You briefly mentioned the impact of federal money and I read some book that talked a little bit about the funneling of all kinds of federal money into the UW system after World War II. Could you just comment on that, on the impact in the 60s?
I think the book you're referring to is called Cold War University, which is, for people who are interested in this period, Cold War University and David Marinis's They Marched into Sunlight are the two essential texts. As Attorney May referred to, it catalogs with great specificity and detail the amazing amount of federal and foundation money pouring into the university, a lot of it out of the National Defense Education Act, creating another ironic dialectic, to go back to our friend Hegel, in that the university grew because of all this federal money. The buildings grew, the enrollment grew, and the students who were brought here protested against the very federal government that was underwriting their education and the expansion of the university. So, to a certain extent, that was a Hegelian dialectic, and now all my Marxist friends will be happy. But again, Cold War University, at one point we were 8th in the country in terms of federal funds, most of it in the natural sciences, funneled through WARF. But the Biotron, the Chem building, the meteorological building, the tremendous expansion of the 60s, fueled largely by federal funds. Martha.
I'll be the last one. I just wanted to say that I looked forward to this presentation. I grew up in Madison, as many people know, and was kind of I was too young to be too active as things heated up early in the 70s. I was told specifically by my parents not to go downtown. And when they told me specifically not to do that, I wouldn't. But I think to Rich's point, and when I told Stuart this morning that I was really looking forward to hearing about it, I was thinking it was going to be the broader picture, and he said it was specifically the UW. And I think many people know my father had been on the radio in the 60s and the 70s and actually started radio shows where he would have to give the question over the air because it was pick up the phone and take the question. But the widespread community involvement about Vietnam was something that it was in addition to the UW. And I just wanted to say, from the perspective of a child growing up in Madison, it was very much a community and political support for what the students were doing.
That's where that student rights thing with Soglin and Bill Dyke and Herman Thomas comes in. That was the point where the broader community said, whoa, there's something going on we better find out about. Let's start organizing these panels and bring Soglin and Dyke and all these people. That's, I think, where the real broad community involvement began.
And I would argue that the broad community was involved in a lot of different ways that might not have had such a momentous turning point. But if you look at the representatives and senators that we had, Bob Kastenmeier, Senator Nelson, the community was very involved.
Oh,
Thank you so much, Stu, for an engaging, informative conversation and talk. He will be here if anyone has questions, and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.